beautifully planned.
Yeah. But, no doubt, prepared as well.
Sorry?
Any tricky questions?
Any tricky questions?
Caroline, from an actual pension fund, would probably be better suited to ask this question.
And yet I do not speak on behalf of all pension schemes, Nigel, so I hand it over to you.
Yes. Yes. Good, thanks. Looking forward to that. We're missing a minister, so if nobody minds, we'll hold on 5 minutes until the services. I've certainly parties have been dispatched, so you can't escape us.
All bases are covered. So is it just you and Katie?
Yeah.
Craig, that's sort of in a plea of the sake.
Yeah, Craig slipped in using his. Morning, hi.
Good morning.
Morning, I'm sorry for the absence of water. Water is on the way for anybody who's parched this morning. Anyway, now that we are quorate, so we will begin. Good morning, everybody. We haven't met. If I haven't said hello to you directly this morning, I'm James Kirkup. I'm director of the Social Market Foundation. Hopefully, you know that you are here for a Social Market Foundation debate along with our friends from the PLSA about pensions and saving the planet. If you're really reeling back home from a late night at the conference bar, you can make your excuse and leave now. But I think it looks like we're all aware of what we're here for, which is good. Quick bit of housekeeping. I think my two standard warnings for events these days are: one, that camera up there is, as we speak now, live streaming this event to the internet, particularly the SMF YouTube channel. I just say this so that you're aware when we get to questions that your questions are not just being shared with the people in the room, but with a lot of with the infinite internet out there, and also the recording of the session stays online. So you have a wider audience, and for posterity.
You are live on Channel 4. Please do not swear.
Well, yes, indeed. The other one is that I think there are no fire drills planned this morning. So if bells and whistles go off, then scream, panic, and run. I don't even know where the fire escape is. That way, run out the door. I don't know. So that's the housekeeping. The conversation this morning. Hopefully, our snappy headline has summed it up nicely. We are here to talk about pensions and environmental investment. Can pensions save the planet? I'll hand over shortly to our panelists. But obviously, since it feels like a very timely event, because the whole question of pension investment for environmental ends is obviously of growing importance. But since we actually organised this event, we've had the publication of the Working Pensions Select Committee report on that very same subject, posing all sorts of interesting questions, some of them for the Minister. So I won't ask Guy for a formal response to the
I agree with everything.
Good. That's done then. But that helps frame the conversation we're having this morning, I think. So with no further ado, let's hope to the longest bit of talking you're going to hear from me this morning. Otherwise, I will point at people and ask questions. I will hand over first of all to Nigel Peaple from the PLSA, our kind sponsors who've made this event possible this morning and provided the life-saving coffee and emolument. So thank you very much, Nigel.
Thank you very much, James. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to the other panellists who've agreed to come along and speak. Guy, obviously, Minister for Pensions, and Gareth and Caroline from RPMI. And thank you for all of you turning up here fairly early on a Tuesday morning for this. And my name, as you probably see from all the literature, is Nigel Peaple. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association. Now, the PLSA, who are we? Just to remind you, we're the organisation for the pension funds, and there are about 1,300 of them in our membership, and they have about 20 million pension savers in their membership, and they manage around £1.5 trillion of assets. But these, of course, are the assets that belong to the members and not to the pension funds. They are basically occupational pension schemes set up by companies to provide pensions for their staff. But there's sometimes those schemes are industry-wide, and most latterly, there's these huge new master trusts which are serving many millions of people with their pensions resulting from automatic enrolment. They're generally not-for-profit organisations, and they operate under trust law, which means they have a fiduciary obligation to act in the interests of their members, and in particular the economic interest of their members. Now, climate. So it's very clear that climate change is going to have a major impact, not only on the planet, but also on the economy. And for pension funds, that means there are two major economic impacts, which of course they need to consider, regardless of any additional statutory requirements. And those economic impacts are the physical risk from climate change, such as the impact on, floods and drought and fire that we've seen, so much of, unfortunately, in the last few years on our news outlets, and a thing that we call transition risk, which is really the impact on economic assets of the changes in policy that are being required of companies in order to combat climate change. So pension funds, acting in the interest of their members, have an economic reason why they need to address climate change, regardless of those additional statutory requirements I'm going to mention in a minute. Now, they have a key role also in helping combat climate change, because they can be a source of capital for the green industries that we need in order to address this challenge. And very importantly, they also have a key role in how they deal with what we tend to call the brown industries, which is what nearly most of us are doing, which is all our normal industries now, many of which do contribute to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And their approach of either engagement or divestment is crucial to achieving a successful overcoming of the climate change challenge. Now, some large pension funds have been at the forefront of these issues for some time, and I'm very pleased that Caroline's here from the Railways Pension Scheme. They've been active on this for 10 or 15 years. And the local government pension scheme, which I know Guy probably doesn't actually want to run, although that's how it's been recorded. Okay. Okay, so the local government pension scheme, which I think has £250 billion of assets, has also, probably because of the political influence from councillors, many of whom probably at this conference, have been addressing these issues for some time. And then there's the government's independent pension scheme, Nest, is very active in this area. And some of the large, well-known companies like Tesco, their pension fund, they're all active on combating climate change. And the top 10 DC schemes have all made a commitment to net zero. However, it has to be said, I think, that this focus on dealing with climate change has only become really widespread, I'd say, in the last year or two, and actually very much because of the gentleman sitting next to me here, the Minister for Pensions, because he has championed a focus on this, first in the reporting requirements on the Statement of Investment Principles that we have to produce annually, and also then in integrating the TCFD process, which I'll explain in a second, into the way pension schemes are governed. So in other words, this task force of climate-related financial disclosures. So what it means is that pension funds have to consider the risk presented by climate change to their assets and to take appropriate action and to report on those things. And these new regulatory and statutory requirements have really helped the rest of the pension fund sector, which was not at the forefront of this, really focused on this over the last year or two, and in particular, even in the last year. Now, don't have too much more to say, don't worry. The PLSA, we try to support our members in recognising the issues that are out there and supporting them in in dealing with those issues. So we've provided lots of practical guidance over the last few years to help pension funds understand climate change risk and even broader ESG issues, environmental, social and governance issues of the companies in which they invest. And we've also produced things like annual voting guidelines to help with that. We had a 3-day conference on these issues just earlier this year, and in previous years we've had conferences and events on it. And on the policy front, we adopted and wrote a report last October, about a year ago, which looked at the barriers to pension schemes investing in a climate-aware way and also identifying solutions to those barriers. And I'm really pleased to say that over the last 6 to 12 months, the government has actually implemented, let me put this another way. The government has itself come to the same conclusion about things that need to be done. There's quite a good overlap there. I'm not claiming that we said we wanted these things and the government did it at all, but it's very good to see that the things that we thought were needed, the government has often been doing, and I will just briefly mention a few of those in a second. And just finally, the last thing I want to say about what PLSA does is that we set standards for the industry, and we've recently consulted on a quality mark for responsible investment, which is a thing that gives schemes a clear idea of what does good look like in this area, to share best practice and also to communicate it to their members. So just finally, so I think for pensions to play their role in dealing with the climate change challenge, we need to have a partnership between government and the industry, and we've kind of got to get the right balance between legal requirements and letting the market work and respond. And as I've said, Mr. Opperman has played his role in setting that statutory context by these new TCFD and other requirements. It's very important that those requirements apply throughout the investment chain, as we call it. So you've got the asset owners of pension funds, then you have the asset managers, the fund managers who often run the funds that they're invested in, and also the companies below them, the corporates. It's very important that they all have similar reporting requirements to the same quality and level. And at the moment, these are being rolled out, so they're applying to pension funds from, I think, earlier, end of last week, and they're coming to these other areas soon. And in that period, as everything aligns, we probably need a little bit of flexibility. The government's also been very helpful in helping define, well, what do we mean by green? And they recently adopted their green taxonomy, which is an indication of sectors and areas that can be considered as helping combat climate change. And I think this idea, and it's something that was coming out of the Select Committee report from a week or so again, that if we in the UK have a clear idea of the pathway that we're on as to what things will make the difference, then it's easier for pension funds to work out where they should invest or not invest, or indeed when they should engage with companies to get them to reform. And so things like the goal of having no new petrol diesel cars sold after 2030 is a really clear signal. And the things that I was hearing about in the media yesterday about having a completely green electricity grid by 2035, again, that's tremendously helpful. Green gilts, enormously helpful, and it's very interesting that the government's first green gilt issuance is oversubscribed by, I think it's 9 or 10-fold. So more of that, please. That means that pension funds will have the right kind of assets to invest in. And the other thing is that it's very important that we achieve these requirements and standards across the world, globally. So that's where COP26 coming up in Glasgow will be so important. It's not to say it's plain sailing, far from it. There are many, many challenges, and really probably the most important of those is really the issue of having good, reliable data about the companies that we invest in and whether they are contributing or indeed moving towards or away from, whether contributing to climate change or moving away from harmful activity. That data, it's not there yet. It's beginning to emerge, there are indices beginning to emerge, and I imagine a lot will happen in this area in the next year or two. I think expertise is a challenge as well for the sector, and I think it's it's tooling up, it's powering up to learn how to grapple with these issues. I think it's worth saying that pension funds, the decision makers are trustees. It's a very conservative party concept, I believe. It's very much people banding together to do the right thing for the workers. So a third of trustees on a scheme are member nominated, so they're from the employees, but often a third is appointed by the business, if that's the arrangement that applies, and others may be professional or just wholly independent. So it takes time to get that expertise going, to get the advisory community going. And just finally, sort of a word of caution. Pension funds are really keen to be part of the solution here, but they can't be the whole solution. Because we frankly aren't big enough and important enough, even though there's this sort of £2.5 trillion of assets. That's small compared to the total finances required. And currently, pension funds own about 2.5% of the UK stock market. And even with the insurers thrown in another 4%, you look at 6.5%. Doesn't mean to say you can't have a very big impact. Doesn't mean to say that they can't, in particular through engagement and stewardship, have a big impact. And then when it comes to corporate bonds, I believe the ownership level is about a third. So pension funds have a role to play, can make a real difference, but at the same time, others will have to do things too. And that's what I wanted to say. And thank you for letting me carry on there a bit.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Our next speaker is Gareth Davies, who mysteriously gave up the delights of the investment management industry to enter politics. Which I'm sure he's happy with that choice. But in the time he's been in the House, he's played a significant role in that green gilt issuance that you mentioned there, Nigel. Takes a very close interest in these matters. So, Gareth, over to you.
Well, James, thank you very much to you and the SMF, and thanks to Nigel and the PSA for that fantastic introduction and run through a lot of the issues that I've seen in my last career, my previous career, dealing with UK pension funds. I think the first thing to say is that we all appreciate in this country that the fact is that the climate is changing and we need to act, we need to do something, the government need to play their role, but critically, investment and businesses need to play a role too. We have the second largest, I think, pension fund market in the world, and that is a potential needle mover when it comes to meeting our 2050 ambitions. And the question is, to what extent should the government interact with the pension fund industry to facilitate that change? And that's the debate that we often have in the House of Commons. But the perspective that I have from coming from the asset management industry is that a lot of change is already happening and has happened already. If you just look at the growth in ESG funds in the UK asset management market, it's only growing because there's demand there. And a lot of that demand is coming from pension funds. A lot of the conversations I've had with pension trustees is that they want to leave this planet in a better state for their kids and their kids' kids. And if they can play a small role with their savings, then they want to do that. But there's a few issues with that, and we'll come on to that in a bit. But the approach for asset managers has changed as well. I think we're moving on from this failed presumption that divestment is the way to go, cut out the bad. But actually, increasingly, it's about proactively seeking the good. And this is about risk management. If you're managing a portfolio of investments, clearly you need to be mindful of all the risks to the potential returns of that portfolio. And increasingly now, asset managers are able to quantify ESG factors and particularly green factors, the E in the ESG. And that enables them to look at non-financial factors that have a big financial impact in terms of performance. So that has been a big development for the industry, and that's one of the reasons why we're growing as an ESG industry in asset management, and why pension funds are increasingly able to invest in an environmentally focused way. It's been mentioned about the government's green gilt, but of course there was lots of green bonds issued by the corporate sector long before the government showed leadership on this area. And I think that's another way. Dedicated, hypothecated debt that enables investors to really ring-fence their investment capital in the bond markets in particular has been a key factor in the growth in this market and given more options to pension has meant that this is no longer about, taking suboptimal returns, which I've heard before in the industry. This is about investment returns, factoring in a risk that helps you achieve greater financial performance. And ultimately, that is how you scale any market in the investment world. And so, by being able to quantify ESG factors and being able to achieve a higher return than you would otherwise, that's how this is scaled to a significant degree. I want to join Nigel in paying great tribute to my colleague, actually, Guy Opperman, who I think will go down as one of the most significant pension ministers.
Stop there, you're doing so well.
And that's my bit, no. But it really is, and TCFD in particular, which he has been a great chaplain of, is a significant event for the industry. And I'll leave that there. But having said that, work must continue. And there are, I guess, 3 areas that I think we can make some more progress on and do even more in the future. The first is around the ability for pension funds to take on more risk. And I think that pension funds, for a long time, have underplayed their hand when it comes to illiquid investments. And that's why I think the LTAF, the Long-Term Asset Fund, which I know the government are working on, will be significant. And we should try and find other ways that pension funds can take on more risk and participate in projects that, for example, renewable energy, that are less liquid, but are impactful on the environment and impactful, by the way, on their investment returns too. The second thing is on transparency. And I read a report from the PLSA which said that 22% of pensioners don't actually know where their money is invested in their pension funds. It's a pretty shocking statistic. And so I think efforts to increase the transparency of where your money is going will naturally lead to better investments from an environmental perspective. And I think fintech will be very impactful on that. My friend Ron Khalifa did a fantastic review, if you've not read it yet, for the Treasury on how we bolster our fintech sector. And I think that has a big role to play in the pension market too. And then finally, we're largely talking about climate change today, but there is a middle letter in the ES&G which is significant and again has been underplayed, I think, in the market and in public policy. Great tribute to Guy again. He's now talking about this and has launched a call for evidence on the S in ES&G. This is about modern slavery, inadvertent exposure to modern slavery and human trafficking, as an example. It's about labour practices, how you treat your staff, how you're governed as an employee in the internal structures of an organisation. Things like that again are non-financial factors that have a big financial impact when it comes to investing in a company. And finally, I talked about green bonds. I think the next big wave is on social bonds. This is dedicated, hypothecated debt in the corporate sector, which ring fences use of proceeds towards activities that have a material social impact. And that is growing significantly, but it will continue to grow in the years to come. Thank you, James.
Thank you very much, Gareth. I'm not going to divert us into a conversation about defining the S, but I'm just going to say I'm extremely pleased to have 2 whole members of Parliament on this panel who are interested in that question of defining the S, which I think at the SMF we're very interested in the S, as you'd expect from an organisation called the Social Market Foundation. But we think that is definitely the next big challenge, and maybe one day we'll get you all back to the Social Market Foundation, probably back in London for a conversation about that S. I'm going to move on. Our next speaker, I'd like to say, is an actual practitioner, someone who actually who manages some of these assets for the newly rebranded, I understand.
Indeed.
The artist
Just a week ago.
The artist formerly known as RPMI, and now to be known as Railpen, in the guise of Caroline Escott. Caroline.
Thank you very much, James. So just to unpack a little who RPMI, Railpen now, even I can't get used to that yet, are, and some of the things that make us special, because that does have an implication for when I talk about pensions and the planet and our work in responsible investments. So we run around £35 billion in assets under management. We are a global investor. We invest on behalf of 350,000 members of the pension scheme. The average member is a 45-year-old man who works on the railways. Our members are dotted all over the country, and this is reflected in the fact that we don't just have a London base, we also have offices in Coventry and Darlington as well. And we are unusual in a few different ways. So the first is that we have many sections which are open defined benefit final salary schemes. Unlike most other defined benefit schemes, we are not on a de-risking phase, we are not at a particularly mature stage in our life cycle. And that allows us to allocate a significant proportion of our portfolio to growth assets, to listed equity, which is the kind of instrument where you actually have an ownership stake in a company, and that gives us influence. It also allows us to invest in illiquid assets, and I'm pleased to hear that there's been quite a few mentions of that on this panel already, because we have a very long-term time horizon, because we are investing for an 18-year-old who joins the railway today and joins the pension scheme as well. We are the 5th largest pension scheme, and that scale as well has benefits. Largest pension scheme in the UK, I think in the 23rd or something largest pension scheme in Europe. And that also allows us to actually manage some of our assets internally instead of delegating all of it to external managers. And that is important for our approach to responsible investment for reasons that I'll come to later. And yes, so I'm here to provide an at-the-coalface perspective. Well, actually, it's probably not the correct idiom for a panel on pensions and saving the planet. But to start with climate, because we are a month away from COP26, I think the first thing to say is that our starting point on all things ESG is to think about ESG risk holistically. So thinking about what ESG risks from both a bottom-up and a top-down perspective are most material to our portfolio and have the most potential impact on good member outcomes. That being said, there is no doubt, and Nigel was kind enough to give us a name check earlier, there is no doubt that climate change in particular has been at the forefront of our minds for quite some time. We were one of the first UK pension schemes to vote against directors on climate crowns where we felt they had insufficient climate expertise and where we felt they weren't properly reflecting the risk of climate change in their financial accounts. We have already been reporting across TCFD, again, something that was name-checked a few times earlier. We've been reporting on it for the last few years, quite a way before the government has required pension schemes to do so. And we're also one of the first UK pension schemes to have a divestment policy on climate grounds. Now, I say that with a caveat. I'm in agreement with other people on this panel that engagement is preferable to divestment. If you want to have a real-world impact on issues like climate change, you need to have a stake in the company, and you need to use that stake to influence accordingly. However, where we think that the risk of climate change or the risk of a company's way of operating is so unmanageable, so that includes companies with significant stakes in thermal coal or in tar sands, we will divest, and we do that. We have a look at that every year and take that forward. Most recently, we have built upon this history in climate activism by publishing a quite detailed roadmap to net zero. So we are committed to achieving net zero by 2050 or sooner. And we set out a step-by-step guide as to how we were going to undertake the first phase of net zero. Our plan currently covers 67% of our portfolio, and that is the listed equities, corporate bonds, and UK gilts portfolio. And the reason I'm highlighting that now is because those are the bits of our portfolio where we feel most confident that we have the information on finance carbon emissions that we need in order to make the investment decisions that are best for our members. We will be looking to push forward across the other aspects of our portfolio as quickly as we possibly can, but we need the information provision, as Nigel was mentioning earlier, and some of the methodologies to develop accordingly. Gareth was right to note that climate change is not the only game in town. Because we take a holistic approach, we are active on lots of different ES&G issues, and I'm happy to talk about modern slavery or any other issues that might be interesting to the panel or to the audience at a later period. But the one particular issue that I will mention, because we are at a conference where the theme is Build Back Better, is workforce issues. We cannot build back better unless we as a country and government and regulators support companies to support their workforces to get to grips with a new normal through COVID, beyond COVID as well. we think that this is a really big issue. It impacts every single company in our portfolio. It is a systemic risk. We also know that it's an issue which matters to our members. So we have a very highly unionised workforce, a very highly unionised membership, and 50% of our trustee board are actually nominated by trade unions as well. We know that lots of people within the membership are active on workforce issues. And to that extent, we have raised workforce issues in every single, that's hundreds, of company engagements that we've had since March 2020, but also quite often before as well, because we've been active on this for a long time. We're working with the PLSA, the CIPD and the High Pay Centre to try to think about how we can encourage companies to give us better information on workforce. Climate metrics, as has been said previously, are relatively well established. They're developing quite rapidly. The metrics for other ESG issues is slightly less developed. And we're also at the moment thinking about pulling together new tools to encourage companies to demonstrate that they have listened to their workforce and can articulate clearly the steps they've taken as a result. One of the things I've been asked to reflect on, as we all have, is the role of policymakers in this transition. And for me, the starting point was, what at Railpen makes my life easier as a sustainability professional at a pension scheme? And what is it that's special about Railpen that is particularly helpful to me? So the first is that we have a really engaged trustee board. We have a trustee board whose response to a full day of climate change training was to ask for some more training to cover some of the issues that we haven't yet been able to cover in sufficient depth. And that gives us a very clear mandate to do the work that we do. It is explicitly mentioned not only in the Statement of Investment Principles, but also in their voluntarily pulled together investment beliefs, that they believe that ESG investment is absolutely fundamental to financial outperformance, and they believe that Railpen needs to be an active owner of our assets in order to achieve real influence on our members' behalf. The second thing is this internal management approach that I was speaking about earlier. So many pension schemes in the UK, as has been mentioned previously, sit at the end of a very long and complex investment chain. Because we hold many of our assets internally, we can have those direct conversations with the company and we can influence them accordingly. We are not trying to work with our investment consultants to influence our asset managers who are then trying to influence the companies at the other end of the chain. We sort of cut out the middleman for a large part of our portfolios. The external managers we do have are excellent, and we seek to influence them accordingly. The internal management is a really key part of what we do. And so we've been really supportive of the work that the Minister and other policymakers have done to support trustees, to help them learn more about climate change and other issues and why it's material. We've also been really supportive of the steps that have been taken to try to encourage trustees to take more ownership within the parameters of their investment arrangements of their holdings. We think having a short or allowing for as much influence from one end of the investment chain all the way to the other end, the company end, is really important. And then just circling back to climate, which is really just emphasising what other people have already said. What do we want to see from policymakers on this? As a responsible long-term investor, we stand committed to investing in climate technologies. We recognise that we don't just need to decarbonise our portfolio, but we also need to proactively support those technologies which are going to permanently mitigate the impact of climate change. And so we need to have a very clear understanding of the extent of government involvement in major sectors and in major projects. So some of the announcements that have come out this week, some of the announcements that have come out previously, give us the clarity that we need to be able to make a fully informed cost-benefit analysis that we need to make the appropriate investment decisions. And then the second thing is that we need COP26 to be a success. Investors need to come out of COP26 feeling confident that governments around the world are absolutely committed to doing whatever it takes to move the planet onto a trajectory that is less than 2 degrees or less than 1.5 degrees of global warming. Once that happens, investors can then follow this inexorable policy logic through to the policy and regulatory change that is needed to achieve change on climate change, and we can use that to credibly apply pressure to our portfolio companies and use that to help shape our strategic asset allocation, but also individual portfolio decisions. So can pensions save the planet? I think that it's the political action and will that can and will save the planet. We at Railpen and many other responsible investors stand ready to continue to help, continue to work with government and policymakers so that we can make the portfolio investment decisions that are suitable for our members and for the planet.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Now, Caroline doesn't realise it, but by mentioning those workforce issues, she's just earned herself an invitation to a forthcoming SMF roundtable back in London to discuss that very thing on a different
Well,
project. So we're doing well this morning. I'm now going to hand over for a magisterial upsum of the issue by my fellow Northumbrian, Guy Opperman, who also has another job. I'm not sure what it is. I think, Guy, can we call you the veteran pensions minister now?
I'm aging fast, I can assure you.
May even possibly be the longest-serving member of Manchester's government in post, isn't it?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
But that means you are an endangered species.
Yes.
Right, shall I stand up?
The elder statesman of
Oh God, that really does date me and age me. So it is hard to follow that, I think, is the honest truth, because pretty much everything I wrote down, green gilts, illiquids, TCFD, the social element and ESG, local government, SIPs, PLSA, stewardship, has all been mentioned. So let me start by saying what are the two things that drive me forward in terms of how we do it. And of course they are, respectively, Robert Browning and Spider-Man. And let me try and explain who those two great watchwords are. Robert Browning is the man who obviously said is, your reach should exceed your grasp, or what else is good heaven for? And in this job, in my view, your reach should always exceed your grasp. You should always try and approach the problem that we all now, I believe, is rightfully accepted of climate change and how we harness the power of pensions to address a problem in a way that is insightful, but also attempting to direct the travel of organisations and the direction that they're going, and in order to get a real outcome that we all seek. And I endorse utterly the three comments by Gareth that of ability to take on more risk, transparency, and the social element are three of the defining things going forward. And it kind of, the Spider-Man is genuinely a phrase used in Spider-Man, I assure you, where I think it's the baddie in Spider-Man is asked, so you now have great power, and he says, well, with great power comes great responsibility. With great responsibility comes greater accountability, and with great accountability you have real change. Now, it's rare that a Marvel picture provides the insightful words that drive forward the pensions minister, but I actually think that is very true as well, because the transparency element, which is what TCFD, climate-related financial reporting, is all about, drives you, the consumer, both here today and watching via YouTube, to have real understanding of what it is that is being invested on your behalf. And I think pension trustees and asset managers are going to find that the consumer is way, way more motivated to understand what is being invested on their behalf as the years go forward. And that is unquestionably the case. And I think it was best put to me by a trustee who is very proactive in this space, who said, as we all accept, if you are investing on a 40-year view and you are not getting engaged in combating climate change and getting us to net zero, then what are you doing? Because if we have net zero by 2050, which, bear in mind, is in less than 29 years' time, then that 40-year view has to take into account all the implications of climate change. And it's not just, in my view, what are you doing in terms of taking climate change into account in your actual investments, but what are you actually doing to fix the problem? And that sort of implies that government is saying to pensions, well, actually, use the vast sums that are available to you. And yes, Nigel is dead right, it's actually only 6% of the entire market, but that's a heck of a big 6% at several trillion pounds. But it is also embrace the opportunity, because, you know, most investment, and I'll take house building as a good, easy example, because I spent yesterday with Legal & General watching them build on net zero housing on a 40-year basis, having competed with Barrett and Persimmon, who have to turn a trick within 24 months, they have to make 15%. So you have a house builder attempting to build stuff and turn it around in 2 years with a 15% margin profit, or you have a pension fund investing a much better quality housing on a 40-year basis that can then go on their annuity book and have an opportunity to make an absolute transformation difference to housing. It's exactly the same, in my view, to climate change investing, because it is the opportunity that is there. It is a win-win, in my view, for both the investor, in terms of the member and the trustee, but also for the country as whole. Now, what government has to do, and we have begun that process to do, is find the opportunities in the short term for pension funds to invest. The obvious two that we can cite are a green gilt. We've had one 15 billion, we'll have another 10 billion later this year. Personally, were I Chancellor, Rishi's doing a great job, but were I Chancellor, the green gilt would be way, way bigger than that. It would be something in the region of 50 to 100 billion pounds, and it would definitely embrace nuclear. That is a work in progress that we are going to be discussing with the Treasury on an ongoing basis. The LTAF, which is the Long-Term Asset Fund, as a product of the Productive Finance Working Group, some people here have been part of that as we have been driving that forward, has been approximately 9 months worth of work, and it is a step forward, but it's not nearly enough, is the honest truth. It is a major step forward, and it will probably see £1 billion plus invested in the right way, but we need to do more on an ongoing basis, and that again is a work in progress with esteemed civil servants at the Treasury and esteemed colleagues across government. There is the final bit I'm going to say, because I want to take questions and I want actually your views rather than just all of us telling you how wonderful we are, much though I quite enjoyed the speeches, let's be blunt, it's about stewardship and divestment. If nothing else you take this away from today, it is active stewardship is in, and you have to get involved with the companies that you are managing, and divestment is a total disaster. There are extreme examples, I accept, where divestment is the very last thing that should be going ahead. But if you think Kwasi Kwarteng, lovely man though he is going to invent fuel cells and hydrogen, go and get on a plane to La La Land, because it ain't going to happen. If you think the Treasury are going to invent carbon capture and storage, it is not going to happen. This is a thing with business, and there is opportunities for pension funds to be backing, both in VC, in long-term investment, the changes that we all see. And divestment is the worst possible result of TCFD, of reporting, and it should be absolutely deprecated amongst colleagues who are doing it, because they're not solving the problem. They are absolutely not solving the problem. They are actually running away from the problem and not engaging with the companies and saying, how is it that you are going to take us there? How is it that you are going to be part of the solution to get us to net zero by 2050? Because for me, that is the defining issue of our time. And if you care about your children, your grandchildren, and the state of this great nation and this world, get part of the solution, because it's an exciting journey that we are on. And, you know, can pensions save the world? Well, we're going to be a very, very big part of it. And it is probably the most exciting time to be a pension trustee that there has ever been. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guy. Well, with that, you've handed over perfectly to the audience for questions, observations, comments. If everyone's feeling shy and sleepy this morning, I have lots. But if anybody want to start off, yeah. Gentleman there.
Craig Rimmer, South Basel and East. Thank you. Craig Rimmer, South Basel and East Thurrock, member and councillor. I think the problem in the past has been with some of the green funds. They've actually done rather well growth-wise, and then you realise they've been investing in companies that are not very good fiscally, and they're not paying their taxes. And when we're talking about the S, isn't sort of fiscal responsibility, shouldn't that come into it as well? And when it comes to how you invest.
How can the E and the S be welded together better?
Absolutely, thank you. Good. You put it much better.
Good
Do you want to take several questions?
Yeah, we'll do a batch, and then everyone can pick from their preferred. Maybe we won't. Maybe that was the bat. No,
Michael.
Michael. The liquids question, I expect. Good.
Well, just to pick up on what Gareth was saying, I think it was implicit in everybody's commentary around appetite for risk. There are two bits to this. The macro, this is one of the riskiest things facing all of us. I love the idea that this is an exciting time to be a pensions trustee. I'm not sure many trustees go into it for the excitement and value. So how does that change? And the second thing then is to get risk, you need to back that by investing in, to James's prompt, the illiquid sector, and declare the interest, obviously representing the private equity venture capital industry. That's an area where pension funds and so on may need to consider greater exposure.
Thank you. And I think we'll do one more.
There's one more at the front.
Gentleman here, and then I think microphone not up to you, and then we'll answer those and see what's next.
I'm pretty surprised actually that it's such a small amount of money that is controlled by the pension funds, which makes me wonder, are we actually saving enough? Is there enough capital to save enough on pensions? And what can we do about that?
I think should we just answer the last question? We'll say no.
No, but I've got a plan.
No, we're not saving enough. But right, so that is better integration of the E and the S, the management of risk and risk from liquids, and I might add to that communication of risk to members, and then essentially pension adequacy. So who wants to start? I don't know how. Shall I be democratic or autocratic, and how
Shall I take it first? Because most of them are for me,
Yes.
by and large. So the social element in ESG, we are, party conference is a funny place because you basically are trying to validate how good you are, right? And how amazing you really are. And not everything in this country is perfect, amazingly, and we know that. But there are some areas where we genuinely lead the way. So TCFD, we are the first country in the world to put that into place. We're also the first country in the world to actually look at ESG and do what is called a call for evidence that genuinely looks at what does the implications of the social element of investing in ESG means. And Gareth is right that it can mean supply chains and issues in modern day slavery. It can mean, when I purchase my mobile phone, is any of these components coming from the Central African Republic and slave labor and things like that. But it is also trying to work out what it is that government then is then going to direct in that approach. And because there has been that problem in the past, there has been greenwashing, and there has been a change in the way in which we look at this, and it has become more important. So it is a work in progress. You're welcome to go. If you Google Guy Opperman S in ESG, there's an article that I wrote in City AM recently, and there's also the consultation, which we still are taking representations on, and I'm still working on. I deliberately have delayed it post-conference because I've done a lot of discussions during conference of what that involves, because it is very much there. In terms of saving, let me just answer, no, we're not. We need to do way more. I need to implement the 2017 automatic enrolment review. There is a whole host of things that then need to be done in a post-Brexit, post-pandemic world to address whether 8% on automatic enrolment is enough, and how it is you would go to the next level, looking at what Australia have done and their struggles to get to 12% and others, and the extent to which that is a contribution by individuals or that is a contribution by companies, and how you marry that up. I also have one niche idea which I'm trying to persuade lots and lots of companies to do, which is a default 1% saving schemes, which I've begun to get great traction with. So if any FTSE 100 companies are watching, what you do is you do a default 1%. So you take 1% of your earnings, of your employees' earnings, out of their earnings and default it straight into a savings scheme. Nothing to do with your pension, no extra pay, you just take 1% with their consent. In my view, it should be done default, but you have to do it on an employee basis, on a consensual basis, and that becomes the rainy day funds that, as the Minister for Financial Inclusion, with people, over 5 million people in this country who don't have £100 savings, which, my lordy, we found out about in the pandemic, that would rapidly transform that in a long-term way. Risk is the defining problem. And we discussed this briefly yesterday, Michael. Putting it bluntly, government has to make it easier for pension schemes to take more risk. But also, I'd like to think, and there is a very famous letter by the Prime Minister and the Chancellor that was written about 6 to 8 weeks ago embracing this particular problem. I like to think we've done an awful lot. We really, really, really have. And if you lined up the 5 big problems, pretty much we've got rid of those 5 big problems. Now, inevitably, then people go, well, and you could do this, and you could do that. But at the same stage, a pension scheme has got to look itself in the mirror. And the great rule is, if you want to change the world, look in a mirror. Because if you can't change yourself, you are not going to change the world. So you have to look in a mirror and ask yourself, are we as an organization in our investment practices genuinely embracing this problem? And are we really so hampered that we couldn't invest in a renewable coverage? Are we really that incompetent that we couldn't go here and do that? Because I don't believe they are. I really don't. And I see, one of the reasons I was sat down with Legal & General yesterday was because they are an organization, and I don't pick them out as any special, there are other organizations who I love, obviously, who are really embracing this problem and are really going, all right, we can do this and we can jump in. And I believe it is still very possible to do more, albeit I think we all agree that government could make the door a little bit wider as well.
Thank you very much. I'll turn to Caroline next to from the practitioner point of view, then Gareth, and then Nigel. Okay.
Thank you. So to Craig's point, absolutely issues have to be considered holistically. This comes back to thinking about the overall ESG risk profile of any asset and of any fund. And the G is a really good example of this. You have a well-governed company. They are going to be just as capable of looking at the big S and E issues as they are any other major risks to their business model. On climate change specifically and the social aspects, one of the things that we are really keen to push through our net zero plan, which is mostly engagement because we want to achieve real world impact, is we are trying to engage with companies to ensure that they are doing as much as they can to contribute to a just transition, to making sure that as the world continues on this gigantic shift, fingers crossed, and I believe will do, to a more Paris-aligned trajectory, that they are mitigating as far as possible any impacts on local communities and workforces as well. That is an explicit criterion and something we will raise with every single company that we engage with across our portfolio as part of our net zero plan. It also fits nicely with the workforce theme that I was speaking about earlier. And then just to talk about the illiquids piece. So one of my colleagues actually sits on your responsible investment advisory group. We do invest in illiquids. We have significant private markets program. We have something we call a long-term income fund, which invests in infrastructure, and most of that is invested in renewables and smarter communications. And from a stewardship practitioner point of view, it's an approach that really excites me, because when you do direct investment, you can have a real influence. You're very close to how that asset is being operated and its impact on local communities. The other thing that we often get called for is an in-house sustainable ownership team at a pension scheme for some of our private markets, and particularly our VC investments, is to work in partnership with them to help them understand what institutional investors generally are looking for on ESG policies and ESG practices. So we work quite closely with them as well. We are always open to new opportunities. It comes back to thinking about what works best for our members on a bottom-up basis, but also as part of our overall portfolio. And for us, private markets, from a sustainable ownership perspective, are very much part of the picture.
Thank you very much, Gareth.
Yeah, Michael, totally right, by the way. Private equity is a big opportunity for pension funds, but I think there are two issues with it. One is consultants. Most of the UK pension market are advised by consultants, and in my experience, they have often been the blockage to investing in ESG, investing in with more risk in mind towards private equity. So I think focus on them more than you probably focus on the government, because in my experience, those are the guys who are preventing a lot of the innovation, if I can put it like that, in pension fund investing. But with good reason in some aspects, because the pension fund industry, is made up of a lot of different pension funds that are quite frankly too small. And I know the Minister's doing a lot to look at consolidating the pension fund market, but that is one of the reasons why historically it just hasn't. If you look at other large institutional comparable investors around the world, they're all massively increasing their private equity exposure. Sovereign wealth funds in particular. Before I left the industry, that was really the only game in town. If you want to talk to the Middle East or Asian sovereign wealth funds, that they were only interested in real assets or PE. So I don't feel too bad for the PE industry because of that, by the way. But I think those are the two issues I would try and tackle: consultants and the size. And you're totally right, by the way. We need to get the pot bigger. There is a sort of cultural shift that needs to kind of take place in our country. We grow up as young kids thinking the biggest aspiration from a money perspective is to own a home, and that's for good reason. But nobody really thinks when they're 18 about how am I going to save for a pension? What's in my pension pot? Can I save for a pension? Can I even save, right? And I don't know how this happened, but we need to try to get younger people to be more mindful of when you start a job, to start saving for a pension early, to really take advantage of compounding and to understand what compounding is all about in the first place. I was quite struck by a report that I saw which said that only, I think, less than 20% of job adverts include details about the pension in that job, even though it can account for about a third of take-home pay, which is bonkers. So, you know, how do we fix that? One of the things I think that we could do as a government, and I know the government are looking at this very seriously in the coming years, is to extend auto-enrolment to 18 to 22-year-olds, so that as soon as you start a job at 18, you start saving and you can see it on your pay slip. But there is a cultural shift that needs to take place, which is, you know, yes, home ownership is really important, but so too is saving for everyday items, but particularly for your pension in the future.
Thank you. Nigel?
Couple of final comments. Just on the issue of pension funds and their willingness to invest in different types of assets and their approach to risk. Obviously, it's worth bearing in mind, you know, we operate under statutes set in Parliament, so pension scheme trustees are expected to operate in line with the prudent person principle, which basically means in jurisprudence that you would invest the assets should be invested in a way that a prudent person would invest those assets. There's a wonderful circular definition. But importantly, also there is a code set by the pensions regulator called the DB funding code, and they're in the middle of reviewing that code, and that has a very big influence on the approach from in particular defined benefit pension schemes, final salary pension schemes, in the way they invest their assets. And it's very important that as the regulator considers where it will land early next year on this, that actually it does allow a risk to be taken in an appropriate manner, which I mean more risk, and that they're not closing down all risk, because they're tending to want to treat open and closed schemes in the same way. I won't bore you with the details or attempt to go into explaining the details of that. So I just think, yes, pension funds can indeed be, you know, open to risk, but they do operate within a legislative regime, some of which is set at the regulatory level. Just on the adequacy point, totally agree with the Minister on the importance of people having rainy day funds, which I think is great, but my request is that this isn't instead of doing extra pension saving. And again, the Minister's made clear that he is intending to address those issues in due course. I just want to mention one thing. You know, the old-fashioned, traditional final salary pension schemes, you were looking at 15-20% contribution, and in many times much, much more than that now. But under the automatic enrolment, you have the thing they call 8%, but because it's not on all pounds of earnings, really it's about 6%. It just isn't enough. And I do think we need to find ways to look at getting that pushed up. The PLSA, we've been arguing we should be going for at least a 50-50 approach. At the moment, it's 2/3 by the employee, 1/3 by the employer. We're saying it should be 50-50. Traditionally, it was 2/3 from the employer, 1/3 from the employee. So that issue about the balance, which the Minister was mentioning, is, you know, I think is a live and important issue. We were saying try and do that by 2030. We were saying that before COVID. You know, we understand that it's a long and difficult journey, but it's still quite a long way off. And I think you know, we shouldn't lose sight of that adequacy goal. And just finally, I thought it's interesting the comments from Gareth about investment consultants. They're not actually, I don't think it's a good thing or bad thing, but they're not actually under a regulatory regime at the moment, although I believe the FCA might be looking at this in due course, looking at a couple of people from the FCA in the room. And actually this links across to the points I was making earlier about TCFD, because the obligation that's on pension funds is now being rolled out to asset managers and to corporates to report about how they're dealing with climate risks. Doesn't yet apply to investment consultants because they're not under a regime. And I think it's very important that it's extended to that. And I believe Gareth was making that point in the House earlier in the year, I think when you were talking about the Pension Schemes Act.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Now, we are, I think, 3 minutes past time, so I should probably call things to a close and release you all back into the wild and to enjoy the rest of your conference day. I will close by, well, thanking you all for coming, thanking the PLSA for making this debate possible. Hopefully we will continue to have these conversations. I think we've raised lots of questions that need further discussion. Thank you to our YouTube audience, both the in real time and the playback audience. You'll be amazed to learn there are people who actually will seek out these videos and to enjoy them again and again.
And again and again and again. Why not?
The viewing figures will rise over time. And most of all, I want to thank the panel, including the aging, rapidly aging pensions minister.
Particularly on day 3 of conference.
Yes,
Yeah.
Guy Opperman. So thank the panel. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Good to see you.